Sante and Kenny Kimes were on a cross-country mother-son crime spree. They had burned a house in Nevada, killed a man in California, stolen a car in Utah, and stolen a motorhome in Florida. But now they had their sights set on the biggest, most ambitious prize of all. They were going to drive from Florida to New York City, and they were going to steal an Upper East Side townhouse right out from under the nose of an 82-year-old widow named Irene Silverman. Not burglarize it or rob it. They were going to steal the whole house. First, Kenny would move into the house as a tenant. Then he would steal the owner's identity, and the mother and son would forge documents transferring her property into their names. And to make sure Irene Silverman never objected, they were going to kill her. It was a bold and an outrageous plan, and it almost worked. A few weeks later, Irene Silverman was blissfully unaware of Sante and Kenny Kimes' plan, but she did have a problem. She had agreed to rent an apartment in the house to a young man, but now that he had shown up, he didn't have any ID on him. She was pretty picky about her tenants, and she wasn't sure if she should let him in or not. Irene owned a beautiful multi-million-dollar townhome less than a block off Central Park. Now today, probably any townhome on the Upper East Side is a multi-million-dollar home, but this was 2006 when multi-million dollars still meant something. Irene was very rich, and she'd admit it, but it had not always been that way for her. Her mother was Greek, a seamstress, and her dad was an Italian fishmonger. Irene went with him when he went out drinking, following him along into New Orleans jazz bars and whorehouses. Irene's dad, though, abandoned the family. Her mom was determined to find a better life for Irene. Her mom moved them to New York City so Irene could study dance with a famed Russian choreographer. There was no money to pay for ballet classes, so Irene's mom struck a deal. She would sew costumes, and Irene would get ballet classes. Irene and her mother lived in an apartment beneath a brothel in Hell's Kitchen, but Irene moved up to a ballet company that performed alongside the Rockettes at Radio City Music Hall. Eventually, Irene settled down with a banker who became wildly successful. The little girl who had lived underneath a brothel now had homes in Paris, Athens, Honolulu, and Manhattan. In 1980, Irene's husband died, leaving everything to Irene. Irene was 64, and she was rattling around in their big townhouse in Manhattan. It had a ballroom on the first floor and a replica of the music room at Versailles. It was beautiful, but big and empty. So Irene had a brilliant idea. She would open up her home as a boarding house, kind of a forerunner of Airbnb. And her tenants would not be just guests, they would be potential friends. It wasn't so much that Irene needed money as that she needed people. Irene was a character in the noblest sense of the word. Friends knew she carried chilled bottles of Dom Perignon in her handbag, just in case. She had a Renoir painting hanging in her bathroom. Now, some people insisted that it wasn't real, but honestly, it didn't matter. It was part of the legend that surrounded Irene. This was the background as Irene stood there looking at the young man who was now trying to check into an apartment in her house. Manny Guerin wanted to rent one of her apartments. And since all of her tenants were potential friends, and since the townhouse was her home, Irene was very careful about who could rent. But Manny dropped the names of a friend of hers and an insurance broker she knew. He was a good-looking, well-dressed young man, and he seemed like he would be a good tenant, but why didn't he have any ID? Irene paused and balanced what she knew. He knew people she knew, check. He looked reliable, check. He insisted he could provide ID the very next day, not really a check. She hesitated, and then Manny did what he knew he needed to do to close the deal. He pulled out a full month's rent in cash in advance. And Irene made the worst, most fateful decision of her entire life. She decided to give Manny a chance. She showed him to apartment 1B and handed him a key. Manny moved into the apartment. Manny, of course, was really Kenny Kimes. It was never completely clear whether Sante also moved into the apartment. Employees would later say there was a woman who hung around nearly all the time, much older than Kenny, but they couldn't really be sure whether she was living there or whether she just came and went. Sante and Kenny began putting their plan into motion. No one ever quite figured out how they selected Irene, of all people, as the target of their next crime. On their trek across the country, they've been hiring people from homeless shelters and stealing their identities. And Irene was most definitely not homeless. But while Sante and Kenneth have been in Florida, they've been researching Irene Silverman. They checked out the property she owned, confirmed she was the sole owner. For months, they worked on their plan down to the smallest details. All the way back in March, which was 2 full months before they ever went to New York City, they set up a bank account. They would use the bank account to fund the transfer fees and the property taxes they would owe when they transferred Irene's home into their names. They called in advance to arrange a room rental for Kenny. By the time they headed to New York on June 15th, the plan was fully hatched. Of course, Kenny didn't dare show Irene any ID once he got there, so he used his charm, his good looks, plus that cold hard cash for a month's rent to talk his way into the house. Once he was safely ensconced inside the house, Kenny set about trying to steal it. He managed to steal Irene's identification, her social security number, her passport. They drew up a bill of sale that would show Irene had sold the townhouse to them. They wouldn't pay her, of course, but they wanted it to at least look official. And now they ran into an obstacle. To be official, the deed of sale had to be signed and notarized. But how could they manage that? They couldn't just go to a notary's office. Sante could pretend to be Irene, but once the notary asked for ID, the notary would very quickly see that Sante wasn't Irene and she wasn't 82 years old. Plus, they needed to make the signature look exactly like Irene's real signature. Their plan was to carefully trace it from the lease of the apartment from Irene to Manny. But they obviously couldn't trace a signature in front of a notary. So, borrowing a page from Little Red Riding Hood, the Kimeses came up with what they figured was an ingenious plan. They called a notary and told him that an 82-year-old woman needed a document notarized, but she was bedridden. Could he please come to the house? And that is how, in July of 1998, a notary public walked up to the door of a posh townhouse on the Upper East Side to see an elderly woman who wanted to sell her townhouse. A young man let the notary into apartment 1B, not Irene Silverman's apartment, and led him back to the bedroom. A woman was lying in the bed. She had an old-fashioned nightcap on her head, and she was wearing a long nightgown. The notary had no way of knowing that this woman was not Irene Silverman, but he could see that she didn't look or sound like she was 82 years old. They handed him the deed of sale to be notarized, but as the notary looked at the document, he realized it had already been signed. As a notary, his whole job was to witness a person sign a document. He was supposed to actually see it. He was not allowed to notarize a document if it had been signed in advance and he didn't see the signature. None of this was adding up. The notary announced, "I'm not doing this," and he turned around and left. The next day, a different notary walked up to the townhouse door and was ushered into the back bedroom of apartment 1B. Once again, a woman wearing a frilly nightgown and a nightcap was in the bed. This time, she was also wearing a red wig. But it still wasn't Irene Silverman. Once again, the woman in the bed had a deed of sale that had already been signed, but this time, the notary completed the paperwork anyway. It was done. The house was sold. The real Irene Silverman had only 72 hours left to live. Kenny used his access to the house to track Irene's movements and figure out her schedule. As it turned out, most of the employees would be off for the upcoming 4th of July weekend. On July 5th, a Sunday, only one employee would be on duty. Irene would be nearly alone in the house. Kenny and Sante made last-minute arrangements. They even spoke to a man about managing the townhouse once they took over ownership. They were ready. Meanwhile, of course, the real Irene Silverman had no idea that someone had signed a deed to sell the townhouse where she presently lived in apartment 1A. And she was blissfully unaware of the plot to kill her. But even so, even without knowing all of that, Irene knew she didn't like Manny Guerin, the young man who was staying in apartment 1B. Irene just wasn't warming to him. He gave short, curt answers when people tried to talk to him. He avoided her glance in the hall. She hired maids to clean the apartments and to water the plants. Most guests were thrilled about this, but Manny refused to let the maids in his apartment. Irene also didn't care much for the visitors he had coming and going. One in particular, a middle-aged woman, it seemed like she was there nearly all the time. She came frequently, she stayed for long periods. It was maybe hard to put her finger on, but there was something about Manny that just made Irene uneasy. It seemed crazy, but she could almost swear he was trying to hide his face from the camera at the front door. And she saw him try to shield the woman's face too. The whole situation was making Irene nervous. For a little backup insurance, she sketched his picture. Just in case, she made a note of the fact that Manny had a little bit of a limp and his nose was slightly crooked. It didn't help that even though a month had passed, Manny still had not managed to produce any identification. Irene knew she wasn't the only one who didn't trust Manny. Her staff didn't like him either. An employee caught Manny lurking near her office, and sure enough, they found footprints in the hallway next to the wall of her office. Could Manny be trying to listen in on her private conversations? One long-term employee came to Irene with a very disturbing story. Manny had tried to convince the employee to leave Irene. Manny said, "These people mean you no good. They are bad. You should be afraid of them." The employee was far too loyal to pay any attention to this crazy young tenant. Instead, he told Irene she needed to get rid of Manny. "Pay him back his rent," he said. "Call the police." The employee could feel the evil. He drew a cross on the top of the refrigerator to ward it off. Irene didn't like Manny, but she also didn't think she was in any real danger. She managed to survive 82 years. She wasn't about to start being afraid of people now. But Irene did have a pretty good sense for people. She'd forged that in the years of following her dad into bars and brothels and living in Hell's Kitchen. She trusted her instincts, and her instinct said she didn't trust Manny. Even if she couldn't quite put her finger on it, she felt something was seriously wrong. Irene came to a decision. Enough was enough. She wanted Manny out now. It was her house, and this needed to end. So even before Manny's first month expired, Irene had him served with an eviction notice. Manny would be moving out on Monday, July 6th. Irene had a lot to celebrate that Saturday, July 4th. It was the nation's birthday, plus Manny would finally be out of her hair in 2 days. Irene hosted a group of her close friends for a dinner party. It should have been a happy occasion, but somehow Manny's shadow cast a pall over the group. One of the dinner guests would later say that they were eating when Irene suddenly pointed to the closed circuit monitor. The tenant, Manny, had just come in, turning his face away from the camera. Suddenly, the friend said, I had a strong sense of evil, which lasted throughout the evening. The conversation kept coming around to this man, and I got the feeling that we were being overheard. The feeling was so strong that the friend even offered to stay the night with Irene, but Irene wouldn't hear of it. She'd be fine. The next day was a Sunday. All of the employees had the day off except Martha Rivera. About 11:45 that morning, Martha let Irene know she was headed out for a few hours. Irene was working in her office when Martha left. Irene was all alone in the house. She had no idea of the danger she was in. While Martha was out, Martha took 3 calls. She spoke to Manny, the tenant, twice. They were odd calls, she would say later. Not suspicious exactly, just odd. The third call, though, was truly bizarre. A woman called Martha to demand that Martha get back to the house and pick up Irene's dog. And then Martha and the dog needed to leave. They needed to go to Martha's home, not Irene's. The call made no sense. Utterly confused, Martha headed back to the townhouse. She got there about 4:42 and banged on Irene's apartment door. When Irene didn't open it, she banged again. Eventually, she gave up and called the police. Police entered the apartment, but Irene wasn't there. Irene kept a lot of cash in the apartment, and the cash was also missing. Martha and Irene's other employees told police that this was completely out of character for Irene. She would not just suddenly leave. In fact, Irene rarely left the apartment at all, and she never left without one of her employees. She had an active social life, but only because she invited people over to her apartment. It was completely impossible that Irene would suddenly decide to go anywhere for any length of time. Irene had not slept away from home in 15 years. She had plans with friends the very next week, and she had already confirmed that her staff would be there on Monday when she kicked Manny out. Police began to ask unthinkable questions, like who might want to harm Irene? And that's when Martha began to tell them about the tenant. Friends joined the search. They went into Manny's apartment and were not exactly surprised to see that all of Manny's belongings were gone. Inside the apartment, police found nothing but a roll of duct tape, an unopened package of clothesline, and a box of 42-gallon trash bags, with 4 bags missing. And there were some other items missing too: the shower curtain liner, the bed comforter, and the pillow. As the police were trying to figure out what had happened to Irene Silverman, across town there was another ongoing investigation, and it was about to collide headlong with this one. Federal agents had tracked a notorious mother and son duo in a crime spree across America, and they believed the pair was now in New York City. Sante and Kenneth Kimes had stolen a car in Utah, and federal agents had tracked that vehicle from Utah to California to Florida and then to New York. Now they had finally found their targets. The feds watched as the mother, Sante Kimes, checked a black duffel bag at the Plaza Hotel. The son, Kenny, parked the stolen Lincoln at a garage and then joined his mom and another man. The feds moved in and arrested Sante and Kenneth Kimes on what was frankly the smallest charge of many they would soon face: the Utah warrant for writing a bad check when they bought the car. Kenny was carrying ID in the name Manuel Guerrero, but he also had numerous documents in the name of an older woman, Irene Silverman. Kenny also had a knife, brass knuckles, and Irene's personal set of townhouse keys. Investigators grabbed Sante's black bag from the plaza. Inside, they found more than $10,000 in cash and even more documents that had Irene's name on them, and 1 surgical glove. At this point, the federal agents had no idea that local police were looking for Irene Silverman, and they didn't know what to make of the documents in Irene Silverman's name. New York police, meanwhile, were looking for Irene and a man named Manny. Fortunately, a federal agent realized that the 2 separate investigations were looking for the same suspects, but they were using different names. He notified the New York Police Department about what the feds had just found and that they had Sante and Kenny Kimes in custody. NYPD sent a detective over to talk to Sante Kimes. She denied even knowing who Irene Silverman was. If Irene was missing, she said, maybe she was just out walking her dog. But when Sante Kimes' bag was searched, police found a claim check for a bag she had left at the Plaza Hotel. Inside that bag, investigators found a loaded .22 caliber Beretta. They also found a folder with the grandiose title, The Final Dynasty. Inside, Sante had the notarized deed and notarized transfer tax form. Investigators also searched the Lincoln, which proved to be a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Officers found blank legal forms, a can of mace, handcuffs, a jar of sedatives, rubber gloves, black garbage bags, an empty stun gun box, and a semi-automatic handgun with ammunition. Inside the trunk was a single empty duffel bag large enough to hold a 6-foot-tall body. Police also found microcassette tapes. One had a recording of a woman claiming to be the manager of a Las Vegas casino, calling to tell Irene that she had won a holiday. All Irene had to do was give her social security number. New York charged the Kimeses with murdering Irene Silverman, but the Kimeses were adamant they were not guilty, and they hired two of New York's top defense lawyers. Sante's lawyer told the media that the case against her was based on speculation and misinformation. It was purely circumstantial evidence, he said. No fingerprints, no witnesses, they didn't even have a body. Cases based on circumstantial evidence are usually much harder for prosecutors to try and for juries to decide. After all, who wouldn't rather have testimony from a witness who saw the whole incident or a video that captured the whole thing? The Kimeses and their defense attorneys went on a media tour ahead of their trial, proclaiming their innocence. I beg for your help, Sante said. My son and I are innocent. There is a huge, evil cover-up going on. The police have made a terrible mistake. Her lawyers complained about the onslaught of negative media, saying pretrial publicity is entirely inappropriate in a case of this magnitude. The police should at least let the jury decide the case, not the public at large, and let the evidence speak for itself. And that's what a trial is all about, not newspaper reportings. At one press conference, Sante was seated between her attorneys. She held both their hands and introduced them as her lawyers, who I dearly love. One of the lawyers leaned in and told her, unfortunately, you've been mischaracterized, and there's been a rush to judgment. Sante said that at 11 every night, Kenneth and she prayed that Irene was all right. Sante's interview could have been criticized as a little theatrical, a little over the top, but the interview of Kenneth Kimes read differently to me. With his lawyers seated beside him, they urged him to let the world know who he really is. It's not like he was speaking off the cuff, by the way. He had a piece of paper in front of him. He literally read from that piece of paper. But before he does, he asks whether anyone has any vodka. Then he reads a statement saying, basically, we're innocent. But more than that, he actually said, my mother and I have been unjustly kidnapped and held hostage for almost a year. Our lives have been ruined. Our family and friends have been tormented. This was my first Christmas away from my mother and my family. But through much of the statement, he was unable to suppress a small grin. It was a bizarre interview, and in my view, not one that helped Kenny Kimes. Family friends also did interviews. Some insisted the Kimeses would never kill anyone, but others were much more negative. Sante's former attorney said Sante had stiffed him on his fee in another case, and he had very harsh words about her. She has absolutely no shame. She's truly immoral. She has no conscience. When Sante and Kenny appeared in court, the media was breathlessly waiting to see what happened, and the public was abuzz trying to understand the dynamic between mother and son. Court observers noted that at their first hearing, Kenny held his mother's hand for a full hour. Watchers said they stroked and caressed each other until the court told them to stop it. When the Kimeses went to trial, Sante's lawyers tried to keep the prosecution from presenting evidence about her past conviction for slavery. Believe me, if you have not seen part one of the series, it is a wild story and it will give you a great deal of insight into the Kimeses. So you are going to want to go back and watch that when we finish here. The judge agreed with the defense that the slavery conviction could not come into evidence, but he warned if Sante testified, that ruling would change. The prosecution would be allowed to cross-examine her about that conviction. So Sante elected not to take the stand. But while the jury was out deliberating her case, Sante was caught passing a note to a New York Times reporter. The judge was incensed and told Sante she had had her chance to take the stand, and she had chosen not to because she didn't want to face cross-examination. She couldn't now get her side of the case out with no cross-examination by leaking it to the media. The Kimeses lawyers had pushed very hard on the idea that law enforcement had never found Irene's body. So, in other words, the prosecution had no direct evidence that she was dead, much less how it had happened. But the jury steamrolled right past that detail. On their very first poll, the jury voted unanimously to convict the Kimeses of murder and 117 other charges. At sentencing, Sante made a long statement blaming everyone, including her own lawyers, for framing her and her son. The judge said she was a sociopath and a degenerate, and Kenneth was a remorseless predator. He slammed Sante with a sentence of 120 years in prison and Kenneth with 124 years. The appellate court easily affirmed, saying there was a veritable mountain of evidence against the Kimeses. The court said that even without a body, the circumstantial evidence was so strong that it gave new life to the traditional saying that circumstantial proof will often paint a far stronger picture of guilt than direct evidence. At the time Irene disappeared, many people believed her body had been dumped in the Meadows, a swampy area near the city. One of the Kimeses' employees told police that as the trio drove into New York before the murder, Kenny pointed out the Meadows to his mother and said it would be a great place for a body. But years later, Kenneth would confess. He would say that his mother used a stun gun on Irene Silverman, and then Kenneth strangled the 82-year-old. He stuffed her corpse into a bag and drove to Hoboken, New Jersey, where he left her body in a dumpster. Irene's body was never found. As a postscript, Sante Kimes passed away at age 79. She was found unresponsive in her New York prison cell in 2014. Now that brings us to a question. Was Kenneth Kimes a self-made predator, or was he the final creation of one of the most manipulative mothers in true crime history? That's where we're going next. You absolutely cannot miss part 3. It's all about Kenny Kimes and a crime so shocking, you will find it hard to believe it even happened. But as always on this channel, it's real. That's what we cover here on the channel: real crimes, real law, and the story behind the cases. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. It would greatly help the channel if you would hit the like button, and please share the video with your friends. See you soon.